Hello, in this video we will be talking about how to make a DB script. First off, we are going to use drop database if exists. This will ensure that we don't have two databases that are called the exact same name. And this database I want to call film movies. Next, we are going to be using create database, which is going to create our database for us. The name kind of gives it away. Drop table, if exists, is the same really as drop database if exists. It just, this goes for the tables in our database. And let me just copy this, since I'm going to be having quite a lot of entities or tables in this database anyways. And now we're going to be using create table to create the different tables in our database. So we're going to start off with the country table here. And we're going to be adding some columns to the table. Now, in order to add columns to the table, we have to put all of our column names and information about them in between these parentheses. Basically, we're just mapping out what our table is going to look like. First, we've named our first column in the country table. Next up, we're adding a data type. We're going to use char, and the definition of char is that all spaces that you define has to be filled. This means that when I write 4 here, I have to fill up 4 spaces with symbols. Whereas in varchar, you don't have to necessarily fill up the spaces. You could just write 20 and you don't have to fill up all the 20 symbol spaces there. Not null is good to use to ensure that you don't get any null marks in the column, especially when I'm using country ID as my primary key in this table. And here I've added a varchar as well, varchar 100, which means that you could write up to 100 letters, or you could write 1 or none, because I didn't add any restrictions on that column. Next up, we're going to use constraint to define our primary key. Constraint basically just tells the system that this is a primary key and it should not contain any null marks or repetition. So first we're going to write constraint, and then you can write a name for the constraint. The name should not be repeated anywhere else. And it can basically just be a random name, but it should probably have something to do with the table. Then we write primary key because that's what we're using our constraint on. And you have to write which column in the table that you're using constraint on. And let's quickly start adding our next table. In this new table, director, the birth year here is an int. An int is a whole number, as I've mentioned before in a previous video. And we're going to set the int to 4, which means that there can only be 4 numbers here, like 2017. Although that would be a very young director, I agree. And let's just continue with our next table. If you pay close attention here now, you can see that country ID is referring to country ID in a previous table that we made. This brings us to constraint foreign key. We are using constraint on a foreign key. We're basically just making sure that there is a primary key in a different table that our foreign key in this table points back to, that it's not just a random number or something. You kind of do some of the same things that you do when you can use constraint on a primary key, but here you have to write constraint foreign key references. When you write references, you write the table that you are referring to, and in parentheses you will write the column in that table. Other than that, where I wrote country FK before foreign key and after foreign key where I wrote country ID in a parenthesis, that is within the table that we're in now, and country FK is the name that I just made up, like we do when we use constraint on a primary key. In some cases, we would use a combined primary key. That means that we are using two or more columns in that table to put together a primary key. In this case, we're using all three of the columns in actor in movie to use as a primary key. We do that by putting all of the column names in the same parentheses. And now it's time to put some data into our database. And we're going to be starting with insert into. When we're typing insert into, we are defining the table that we're using and what columns we're inserting data into. So we want to start by adding data into our country table. And there need to be some actual data in there as well. We use values when we are adding data to the table. Here you need to remember the order that you put the columns in, because you're going to start with that. So we have our primary key first, country ID. So I'm going to call that first one C001. And then we're going to have the name of the country, which is the United States. Could add the names of the columns next to the name of the table, but that will kind of be a bit redundant, unless you want to change the order of how you put things into the database, or if you want to leave something out, like we're going to do here. For now, this first director that we're adding to the director entity does not have a middle name, so we're just going to add the director ID, first name, last name, birth year, and gender. And that will also be the order of how we insert the data. So we're going to insert director ID first, then name, first name, last name, birth year, and gender. And let's quickly insert the rest of the data. Okay, we're almost done. Let's see how it runs. Oh, we got an error message. And no database selected. Of course, because we need to use database, of course. Use quite simply tells the system what database we're going to be using. So you can use for queries, or as we're doing now, we're using it to insert columns and data into our new database. Now we got a new error message saying that director ID doesn't exist. Of course, because if you see here, the director ID does not actually exist. I've called it dir ID. And it's working! All compiled. Wonderful. Let's just quickly check out our new database. There you go. That's how to make a DB script. Hope you enjoyed the video and hope you learned something. Have a nice day.